Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar, Best Practices in Leading Virtual Teams, is part of the Wisconsin School of Business 2020 Alumni Webinar Series. My name is John Zalewski, and I'll be the host for today's webinar. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded. Before we get started, I'd like to turn things over to Natalie Singer to say a few words. Natalie?
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Singer, and I work in alumni relations at the Wisconsin School of Business. There's a lot going on right now, so I hope that wherever you're joining us from, that you are healthy and safe. Several weeks ago, we began looking at how we could provide more digital content and resources to our alumni in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. We've received a great response and hope these webinars and our other virtual events and resources have been helpful for you. We're happy to partner with the team at CPED to provide many of our webinars, and I'm personally really looking forward to hearing these tips about leading virtual teams as our team continues working remotely. I wanted to also briefly share what else is coming up from us at WSB. We're assessing other ways we can connect our community, but what we know for sure is that we're going to continue to provide webinars. I've included here a list of upcoming dates and topics, with our next webinar coming up as early as tomorrow. So we're continually adding to this list, so watch your email and we'll be announcing some new topics very soon. I also want to call your attention to our new event series, Badger Executive Talks. These live events will be broadcast to YouTube, where Dean Samba Murthy will be facilitating a conversation with each guest, sharing their lessons in leadership and engaging the alumni community in a live Q&A. The first of these is coming up on June 16th at 7 p.m. Central Time and will feature John Pearson, a BBA alum who is the Chief Executive Officer of Deloitte Risk and Financial Advisory. You can find more information about these events and our other alumni resources on our website, wsb.wisc.edu/alumni. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to John to get us started.
Thank you, Natalie. Today's webinar is also brought to you by the Wisconsin School of Business Center for Professional and Executive Development, which partners with individuals and organizations to enhance performance and productivity through professional development programs, certificates, coaching, consulting, and assessments. Professional development programs are delivered on-site at the Fluno Center in beautiful downtown Madison, and we are also offering online programs facilitated by instructors with practical, real-world experience. The Center for Professional and Executive Development also partners with organizations throughout the country to provide customized on-site and online professional development programs, coaching, and consulting. For more information on the Center for Professional and Executive Development, please visit our website at uwcped.org. If you have a question you'd like to ask during today's session, you could submit those questions using the questions box from the sidebar, and you can expand or collapse the sidebar using the orange arrow. We'll post some questions that are submitted during a Q&A at the end of today's webinar. There are some questions we'll pose to you during today's webinar as well, and you can respond to those questions also using that questions box, which for our purposes is going to serve as a makeshift chat box. And now I'd like to introduce today's facilitator, Lee Johnsen. Lee?
Thank you for having me, John, and welcome to Best Practices for Leading Virtual Teams. I'm really pleased to be here with you today. Many of us have limited experience leading remote teams, and most likely we haven't had much training on how to do it. And then all of a sudden, bam, we woke up one morning and the way we conduct business, and hopefully for the short term, the way we live our day-to-day lives has changed. Most of the workforce is now working from home, and we've all had to jump in with both feet and just try to figure it out as we go along. In addition to what I'll be sharing with you today, we'll also be providing two participants complimentary copies of my book, Literally Virtually, Making Virtual Teams Work. So stay tuned, and winners will be contacted following the session. You know, all of us are experiencing many different emotions right now, and I'm wondering how you all are feeling. So I'm going to ask you to send us in chat just one or two words describing an emotion you're currently feeling as you adapt to this remote workforce. So please go ahead and type that into our chat pod right now.
As a reminder, you can use the questions box for that as well. This will be a good warm-up for using that to submit the responses, and I'll read some of those aloud as they come in. All right, we're starting to get some responses. People are reporting feeling frustrated and grateful, anxious, fatigued. Some people, this is still a very normal way that they work. People are reporting feeling grueling and anxious and alone, and certainly lucky and grateful that they're still working too. So really a wide range of emotions we're seeing here, Lee.
Thanks, John. And as you can see, you're not alone. In fact, what you're experiencing is what our customers and our clients are feeling as well. We have to not only figure out how to survive in the short term, but we also have to think about how we thrive in our future. In 2014, I spent 5 months working in Saudi Arabia while managing my business in the US, and it wasn't easy. But even before then, I became fascinated with the differences between on-site teams and the one whose members were separated by geography, time zones, culture, and technology. And I noticed that organizations and teams that don't address these differences consequently risk some disappointing results. Almost overnight, many of us were transported from working at an office to working at home. And now we have to figure out how to juggle our work life and our home life all in one place. I wrote literally virtually because virtual teams and remote workforce aren't the way of the future. They're the way today. So leaders and team members who work virtually have to learn to communicate and collaborate differently. For the past several years, I set about discovering the best practices that lead to successful virtual teams. I created a model and a process for high performance, along with tools and assessments and training to help virtual leaders and members not only adjust to these differences, but to thrive. So here's what we're going to be talking about today. A few of the drivers that are pushing us to adapt quickly to virtual work. Top challenges that virtual team leaders are facing today and teams. I'm going to share with you 5 best practices for managing and 5 best practices for leading virtual teams so that you can implement them on your own. I'm going to walk you through the foundation and show you a couple of templates and checklists that you can use to implement some of these best practices. You know, the drivers for a remote workforce are pretty obvious. COVID-19 will redefine our lives for generations. It's going to change how we live, how we work, and how we interact with one another. So we know that COVID-19 is the main driver of a rapid transition. Let me share with you what some of the other ones are. These are drivers that are leading to a remote workforce that's been in the works for some time. What's changed is the speed in which we need to adapt to this new normal. But once we reach a certain point, the economics and the market psychology are going to transform how we do business in the long term. Customers are going to expect more remote service options. So we have to think of beyond current state and get ready. So let me share with you ways that you can successfully transition from survival to revival and engage your remote workforce. But first, I want to talk about what are some of the challenges. Here are some of the most common challenges supported by multiple research study and my own experience, and I suspect that many of you have experienced some of these as well. Aligning team members behind the team's purpose and vision. In the midst of rapid change and the survival mode, it's easy to lose sight of the meaning and the purpose behind our work. Building trust from a distance is important because trust is essential, and maintaining and deepening it is more challenging in the absence of face-to-face interactions. Balancing structure and empowerment considers new questions about decision-making authority and work hours flexibility, ability to adapt current work processes, and so on. And creating and maintaining engagement. When people are working virtually, it's common to become anxious and disengaged. We heard some of those words in your chat. So remote members need to connect and support each other. And learning and applying technology is a frequent challenge until everybody can get comfortable using it and making connections and accomplishing their work. And then finally, making the implicit explicit. The absence of face-to-face communication requires virtual team members to be much more specific and intentional with their words and their tone of voice. So misinterpretations are more frequent, at least initially. So as you look at this list of challenges, share with us a top one that you've dealt with, and type that into chat if you would.
So again, feel free to drop those into the question box, and you can just put the first word in there too, as opposed to writing out the full thing, and we can track it that way. So Lee, we're seeing responses across the board. A lot of folks saying that they're struggling with balancing and that's been a challenge. Another one that came up was how to measure productivity. And then building trust remotely and technology challenges are both appearing here as well. Misinterpreting communication, aligning. So yeah, I think really a good mix of all the challenges you mentioned.
Well, I think that's validation that a lot of us are dealing with these challenges. And I'm going to speak to, I think, most every one of them. So let me just say it. Leading virtual teams is indeed more complicated and more time consuming than teams whose members are all in one location. And unless we accept that, we're going to continually be frustrated. I know a leader right now who has team members in 5 different US time zones. His world is much more complex and time consuming than if everybody was in the same office. What we know is that virtual teams require greater flexibility from leaders and members due to complexity and reliance differences. Complexity is about the challenges associated with differences in geography, time, technology, and culture. And complexity tests us to find different ways to build trust, to communicate and achieve results. Reliance means that the more that team members have to rely on one another to accomplish results, the greater the need for trust and collaboration. And as you heard me say earlier, trust is critical. We have an assessment that allows leaders to identify complexity and reliance factors for their team, and then key actions that they can take to maintain productivity. So even though virtual teams are more complex and time consuming, here's the good news. When they're well managed, virtual teams are more creative, productive, and achieve results equal to and often surpassing on-site teams. And I believe that the best managing and leading practices that I'm going to share with you are going to make a dramatic difference in your success. In my book, Literally Virtually, I offer both strategic and practical approaches to address these dynamics of virtual teams. I created a model to illustrate the various stages of preparing virtual teams and delivering results, and I just want to offer you a little bit of an insight into the model. This long-distance leadership model represents our approach to successfully launching and maintaining a high-performance remote workforce. We developed the model to offer leaders both a map and a process for developing their own virtual teams. You can see the model includes 5 stages with 2 components in each of the primary 4: plan, prepare, produce, and results. And I'm going to use this model to frame for you the best practices for team management and leadership practices that I'll share with you. We don't have time to cover everything in the model, but I'm going to highlight what I think are the most important ones for you today. Now, you just heard me say virtual team management and leadership practices. I wonder if you think that they mean the same thing, or do you see them as something different? So I'd like to explore that a little bit with you. And this is an opportunity to, again, get us some of your thoughts through chat. So I'd like you to type into chat, what would be some words that you would use to describe what a manager says or does? So when you think of the role of manager, what words would you use to describe what that manager says or does? So you might say something like setting goals or budgeting or measuring progress. What would be some other words you would add you feel are descriptive of a manager's role or what they do or say?
All right, these are coming in, Lee. So we have, and I'm just going to read through these quickly: supervise, direct and control, delegate, provide work direction, performance reviews, structuring processes, taking care of transactional management functions, setting due dates, prioritizing, and so on and so forth. A lot of good responses here.
And that's a good list. And many of them are you're seeing here as managers. Managers often deal with the presence. They're promoters of stability. They figure out how to get things done, and they ensure efficiency, compliance, and manage processes. So if this is what managers are doing, what is it that leaders would do or say? So what words would you use to describe what leaders do? And again, I'll invite you to share those in chat.
All right, some responses we're getting here, Lee, are strategizing and influencing, setting a vision, inspiring employees, motivating employees, setting goals, coaching, being the forward-thinking part of the organization, and again, setting that long-term vision, mission, and strategy, and driving engagement.
So excellent. So if we think of managing as a science, leadership is more of an art, and you identified many of the things that are already on this list. Sometimes we put value judgments around leading versus managing or vice versa. But the truth is that organizations need both leadership and management. During this time of survival, organizations need their virtual leaders to provide clear direction. Your team members need help in figuring out how to work virtually, what stays the same, what changes. They need structure. And that's where those of us in management and leadership roles need to focus our attention as we help these team members gain a new sense of stability. But as we gain more experience, we'll eventually move into this phase that I call revival. And that's where when our team members need a sense of the future of their organizations. They need to reconnect with the vision, to be inspired, and to feel like they have a sense of empowerment to make decisions and achieve. They need leadership that provides them support and a sense of direction. So let's talk about some of the unique skills associated with effective virtual team management and leadership and how those skills are demonstrated. The Society for Human Resources Management says that effective leadership is the #1 factor that influences success in a virtual organization. And here are some of the leadership and management competencies identified as critical for global virtual teams. And if they look familiar, it's because we saw them in an earlier slide when I was talking about some of those virtual team challenges. These are the skills that help virtual teams move from survival to revival. Now, at first glance, they might seem like the same skills applied in face-to-face interactions. But the differences are in how the skills are applied when people are separated by physical geography, time, technology, and sometimes culture. So we've developed an assessment so that individuals can identify their strengths and development needs and then focus on the ones that are most essential for them to lead their virtual teams. So for today and for simplicity, I'm going to use the term virtual leader. And as I share with you these best practices, I'm going to do it in the form of those which fall more under the management or structure role and those that tend to fall more under that leadership or support role. So these are the 5 best practices for managing virtual teams. These are the things to focus on, especially during this time of transition. And then as your virtual teams mature, you'll want to continue these practices until they feel like habits. So let me go into each one of these in a little more detail and give you some examples of how to apply them. The first is technology. And for a lot of us, the thought of mastering technology, more technology, makes our head spin. So let me share with you a few tips about technology. Many of us sort of have this love-hate relationship with technology. We love what it can do, but we hate the climb up the learning curve to get comfortable using it. And the choices of technology can sometimes seem overwhelming. So whether you're in a position to choose the technology or your organization's IT department makes that decision, select a few synchronous or same time technology tools and asynchronous or different time tools to use with your team, and then master them. this chart that I'm sharing with you shows some common tools that are available today with some examples and best uses for each of them. Once you've selected the technology, and this is key, invest time to train yourself and your team members and practice using them enough to get comfortable and efficient. The biggest reason technology is underutilized is because people aren't skilled and confident in using it. Some other points to keep in mind: video engages people and is particularly helpful if you have emotional issues to address, because you'll be able to see the person's face as well as hear their words and their voice. Email's great if you're only communicating with a few people, but beyond that, use tools like SharePoint or Microsoft Teams that provide message tracking and collaboration. And always make it a habit to verify understanding of any agreements that are made. Somebody raised the question in chat earlier, and it's not an uncommon one. I sometimes get questions from leaders wondering about tools and tips and techniques to help managers and their team members with accountability. So let me share a couple of them with you. One of them is what I call the team operating agreement. It's the second best practice. A team operating agreement is a written document that's created by the team members and leaders that not only describes the team's purpose, goals, and results, but it also includes several agreements that team members make about how they're going to work together. So the example you're seeing here includes the team's values and ways that members demonstrate those values and trust. It includes agreements for technology protocols, meeting management, decision-making, and dealing with conflict. A question also that I often get is, well, we've been leading teams virtually for quite a few weeks now. Is it too late to put in place a team operating agreement? And my answer is it's never too late. As a virtual team that's been operating for a few weeks, you probably already encountered differences in understanding and response times. Maybe it's felt clumsy knowing what tools you're using and where they're located. Some people are shy about using a webcam, and many people hate virtual meetings, and there are more of them these days. So these are the kinds of things that can come up in a team operating agreement discussion, so you can create consensus and reduce some of the challenges as they occur. So I'd be interested to know how many of you currently utilize some form of a team operating agreement. Sometimes they're referred to as a team charter. And just if you would, give us a yes or no in chat. If you currently have a team operating agreement or something similar to that, give us a yes. And if this is not something you have in place, just do a quick no.
All right, Lee, I'm watching the responses come in, and from eyeballing it, I'm going to say it's about 80-20 no.
So this is one of the best practices that will help you and your team members not only have some accountability, but also to clarify how you best work together. This is part of that structure that I was mentioning earlier. We offer a template so that you could create and customize your own team operating agreement. So you might want to think about that, or certainly there are other options. Here's the third best practice, and that is going virtual is an ideal time to look for ways to streamline your work processes and procedures. Using this best practice, one of my colleagues was able to automate a process for completing monthly reports that literally saved his company hundreds of hours. And it's likely you've got some similar situations. So as your team members settle into new remote working routines, think about or reconsider your processes and procedures and find ways to make them more efficient and boost productivity. Ask your team members for their suggestions. They'll have some. Listen to theirs and share your own. Now's a good time to pay attention to how the work gets done. And one reminder, always test before implementing. A common question that leaders have about remote work team members is if they're actually working. Guess what? research finds that virtual team members on average work 3 to 4 hours more per week than on-site workers. Now, that said, it's important to talk with your team members and be clear about your expectations. You might need to remind them when to stop working so that you don't end up with disengaged members who are putting in unapproved extra hours. On the other hand, a common concern of virtual team members is not being acknowledged for the results that they do accomplish. So for both reasons, a team member dashboard is helpful. And here's another practice to aid in accountability for managers and team members as well. This is a snippet of our team member dashboard to help leaders and team members identify, track, and assess their lead and lag performance indicators. Lag indicators are under the far right column, the orange column. These are the quantitative results that measure productivity, quality, and so on. And most of us are already familiar with these. The lead indicators are highlighted in the middle two green columns. These are the behaviors and the relationships applied to achieve those lag indicators. They're the early signals as to the likelihood that the outputs and the results are going to be accomplished. So you want to pay attention and track these. Positive lead indicators lead to positive results. If you notice negative lead indicator behaviors, the consequence is often missed deadlines or quality and productivity problems. And the far left column lists possible data sources to give you information about the indicators. And of course, you can customize these based on your team. Dashboards are becoming easier to create all the time, and it's okay to start out with a simple Excel spreadsheet. Use whatever technology you're familiar with. The important thing is to have a discussion with your team members about the indicators so you can reach a common understanding of what they are and what they mean. That ensures joint accountability. And remember, leaders are responsible for being accountable too. All right, let's face it. Right now, all meetings are virtual and we're all required to work at home. So sometimes multitasking is an absolute must as we try to balance our calls and our families. But let's think beyond current day. And for a second, think about attending a virtual meeting or a webinar pre-pandemic. And here's the question, pre-pandemic, what percentage of people do you think are multitasking during a virtual meeting? And please type that into chat. What percentage of people do you think are multitasking during a virtual meeting?
All right, Lee, I've got a lot of responses coming in here. Again, kind of all over the board, ranging from 10% all the way up to 100%, with an average, I would say probably around 75% to 80%, and definitely trending higher.
Well, it definitely is on the high side. The research says that it's been found as many as 90% of people in virtual meetings are multitasking. I'll bet some of you are doing multitasking right now. So let's talk a little bit about what we can do to improve our virtual meetings and increase engagement. The best virtual meetings are distinctly different from most in-person meetings. So let's look at some of the key differences between a typical face-to-face meeting and an effective virtual meeting. For typical face-to-face meetings, the research shows that the majority of time is spent in the actual meeting itself, with about 10% of time invested in planning the meeting and another 10% as follow-up. Now, look at the differences between how time is spent in an effective virtual meeting. Leaders of the best virtual meetings invest time upfront prior to the meeting, not only planning the agenda, but they also consider what technology they'll use to engage participants and facilitate decision-making. So they use polls and chats and screen sharing and live webcam and other tools that keep people engaged in providing input. The planning pays off in that means there's considerably less time spent during the meeting itself. And follow-up is helpful, is key to make sure that everybody has the same understandings and is clear about their responsibilities. So more time is needed to plan the virtual team meeting, and since that takes more time, we put together a checklist to guide virtual meeting planning and preparation. Here's how the best virtual team meetings are created. Our checklist helps leaders and team members leverage their meeting time by providing both the structure and the support they need to make good decisions and accomplish results. Notice that it's divided into practices before, during, and after the meeting and the tasks associated with each one. And here are 5 more tips to go along with the checklist. As part of your planning, make sure you include 5 to 10 minutes at the beginning of the meeting to connect socially. Invite team members to share a success, a hobby, something fun. In face-to-face meetings, that happens naturally. It's important because it helps to build social bonds among team members and to boost engagement and commitment. And share meeting responsibilities. Involve others in facilitating the meeting, managing polls and chats, and someone to keep minutes. The more involved people are, the more engaged that they'll be. And follow-up is equally important to make sure that there's a common understanding of the actions and accountabilities for the after the meeting assignments. So these are the 5 best practices for managing virtual teams. These are the things to focus on, especially during this time of transition. But as your virtual teams mature, continue the practices until they become habits. So now, let's move on to the 5 practices for leading teams. But first, let me connect back to the model for a moment. The leadership practices are captured in this model in the produce and results stages. So I want to share with you how the leadership best practices are a bit different from the management best practices. And here they are. These practices reconnect team members with the organization's mission and vision and culture. They provide support and a sense of future possibilities that both inspire and empower team members. And I'll go through each one of these in more detail next. There's an old story about a consulting firm that interviewed 2 teams that were doing exactly the same work. And the work they were doing was chipping rock all day. So the consultants asked the members of the first team, what's your work? What do you do? And the team members looked at the consultants and they said, well, we chip rock. So the consultants thanked them and they went to the other team that was doing exactly the same work. And they asked them, what's your work? What is it that you do? And the answer they got was, we're part of a team that's building a cathedral as a monument to our love for God. Which team would you want to be on? You see, the leader of the second team helped the team members to connect their work to a larger purpose. When people are separated by differences in geography, culture, technology, and time zones, it's easier to lose sight of the big picture and the team's purpose. As virtual team leaders, we need to be more intentional and invest time to help our team members stay connected with the larger meaning of their work. And whether you're the leader of an organization, a division, a department, or one team, if you can't describe your group's mission and vision, your team members are going to become disengaged and unaligned. So make time with your team members to talk about how their work connects to the larger picture. This is about focusing not only what work gets done, but why it's important. And in times of turmoil, team members need to know that their work means something bigger than just completing the task. So how do you know when you've been successful in communicating these? When you hear your team members use the same language you would to describe the team's mission and vision. One of the most important leadership practices you can apply is to establish regular one-on-one coaching schedules with each team member. These coaching conversations are intended to be helpful, constructive, and developmental. In other words, the focus is to help team members become even more effective in their roles. The topics might range from listening to one of your team members' concerns to solving a problem, improving a skill, or even discussing future opportunities. So let me ask another poll question here. How frequently do you have one-on-one coaching conversations with your team members? Now, be honest. Do you have them weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually, or would you describe it as sporadically? How often do you have these one-on-one coaching conversations with your team members?
So Lee, judging by the responses we're getting right now, it looks like a pretty even mix between weekly, monthly, and bi-weekly or twice a month, or some mix thereof.
Great. Well, I think whether it's weekly or bi-weekly, that's going to be different for every team based on the work they do and what's happening on the team. The importance is that they're regular. A common concern that team members have, that virtual team members have, is this out of sight, out of mind. Regular one-on-one communication with your team members strengthens those bonds of trust and support, and it ensures that you have mutual understanding of results and expectations. In particular, during times of transition and disruption, you're going to want to increase that frequency a bit. This is an example of a quick reference guide we've created to guide the participation and a flow of a one-on-one conversations if you're not using those. Notice that it's divided into pre-coaching, the coaching conversation, and post-coaching with steps along the way. And so this does suggest that there's some planning involved prior to having these conversations. And keep in mind also that there should be joint accountability between you and your team members for bringing information and making these coaching conversations productive. Due to the pandemic and the rapid transition to remote workforce, many organizations are dealing with a ton of questions about flexible work hours, cost sharing of hardware and internet services, absenteeism, and customer services. My advice is to decide where you can be flexible and what must remain consistent. As you work with your HR leaders to put in these new practices and policy changes, make sure that any policy changes represent your team's and the organization's culture. It's important that you align them with the organization's values and remain genuine and transparent, because your responsiveness helps to maintain trust and engagement. And as the policy changes are implemented, make sure that you communicate your message 7 to 8 times in multiple ways. Research shows that it takes 7 to 8 times of repetition in multiple media forms for people to connect with a message. So over communicate to make sure that everybody gets the message. Our fourth best practice is for every leader to develop a communications plan to inform key audiences, including team members, customers, vendors, and stakeholders, about your transition to either a remote workforce or a more remote workforce and the impact on what you provide them. And create some processes for tracking and communicating status and updates. Figure out your messaging and then how to best deliver it 7 to 8 times in multiple ways. Organizations that don't plan and regularly communicate with their stakeholders are at risk. A friend of mine once said, people don't forget about you on purpose, they forget about you on accident. So make sure that people hear from you. They're much more likely to be supportive of you if they know what's happening. I mentioned earlier that most of us have been in a triage mode and just trying to find some normalcy. Engagement with our team members has probably taken a back seat. So let me mention a few ideas for rewarding and recognizing team members. This is our last best leadership practice, and that is to recognize and reward positive behaviors and results. During these times of transition and instability, it's especially important to celebrate milestones and the small wins. As you look at this chart, maybe you think that at first glance, there's nothing new about these suggestions. But what may be new for some of you is how to deliver them. How do you celebrate a birthday when you can't gather everyone around in the same room around a cake? For some virtual teams, some companies have a piece of cake delivered to each member's home, and they all have cake together at the same time. It's also a great way to support local businesses. Another example, and I'm sure you've seen many of this one yourselves, is a leader I know who hosts a virtual happy hour with his team on a Friday afternoon using Zoom so that everybody gets a chance to see one another and connect. These thoughtful recognition and reward practices build social bonds and connections that are important to effective virtual teams. And be sure to ask your team members their recognition preferences. Some people like public recognition. Others prefer it to be private. Either way, making it personal makes it meaningful. So with a little creativity, there are lots of ways to recognize and reward team members that can be just as meaningful as if delivered face-to-face. So to review, here are the 5 best practices for leading virtual teams. These are the practices to reconnect team members with the organization's mission, vision, and culture. They provide support and a sense of future possibilities that inspire and empower team members. When I was 47 years old, I completed the Chicago Marathon within 2 minutes of qualifying for the Boston Marathon. I had never run a marathon before, but what got me through was a training program that provided structure and a training team that provided support. That's what your virtual team members need from you, structure and support. These are the management and the leadership practices that reconnect team members with the organization's mission, vision, and culture. They provide a sense of future possibilities that inspire and empower team members to move from this survival to revival. The last stage of our long-distance leadership model is called review, adjust, and redirect. And most of us have been doing a lot of that over the weeks and will be doing more over the weeks and months to come. And no matter how well planned things are, we'll all have to adjust and redirect. But here's the ultimate goal. We need to work together as if we're all in the same room, even though we're not. I have a friend whose motto is AIO, adapt, improvise, and overcome. And I think that's pretty good advice for all of us right now. So for the remainder of our time, we would like to open it up for questions that you might have, and feel free to send those questions in through chat.
Thank you, Lee. And as Lee said, if you have some questions, feel free to throw those in the question box. We did have a few come in throughout the session that I'd like to pose to you now, Lee. So the first one is, do you differentiate, and if so, how, between a remote worker and a virtual team member?
I think in short, the difference is the level of interdependence. You know, the greater the level of interdependence among people who work remotely, the greater the need to work effectively as a virtual team. Let me give you an example. Members of a new product development team have a much higher level of interdependence, that even though they may represent different areas of expertise like design and engineering, operations, manufacturing, they have to work together to create a finished product. On the other hand, people in roles like insurance claims adjusters, graphic designers, independent consultants, and so on, they tend to work more independently. So there's less need for high collaboration and being a part of the team's day-to-day interaction. So that's how I would differentiate between remote workers who tend to work more independently for their job tasks and the need for people to be a highly collaborative virtual team member.
Great, thank you. Lee, we had another question from an individual who said their organization has a culture of relying on emailing to the masses, and is wondering about if you have any recommendations for shifting the communication culture to more personal and effective methods of communication.
Yeah, email is both a blessing and a curse. The way I would help make that shift is to start with your own team. And I think that's a good topic to start and include as a part of your team operating agreement. You know, lead a discussion about how you can best communicate with one another. And you might start by just asking them what's working and what's not with their communication. And then start with a little brainstorming to overcome the challenges. Consider what technology you have available. Some organizations have social media connections such as Slack or Yammer. Email works great for about 3 people. Beyond that, then it can get messy fast. So some technology that allows you to use threaded discussion boards in order to be able to track one another's comments. Decide on those protocols for emails, especially. When you need to use email, then include some protocols around reply versus reply all, or the length of emails. You know, the shorter is the better. It's also a good idea to put in the subject line, are you asking people to take action? Are you asking them for a quick reply or to make a decision? So provide people simple, clear directions as to what you're asking them for. And then once you have agreement on the protocols, make sure you share those and have consensus and agreement to follow up with those and make sure that they're working and holding one another accountable. So start with your team, keep it simple, but as a team, identify what are the protocols around your email and when you use email and when you're going to use some other technology.
All right, thank you. Lee, the next question, I'm taking 2 questions. I'm going to combine them. I think they're getting at the same core here. So a lot of companies have had to move people to working remotely from an office environment. Do you have any recommendations on what organizations can do to develop their managers if the decision is made to keep that setup permanently? And in a related sense, do you have any recommendations for how organizations can start transforming managers into leaders in a remote environment?
So one of the things is I think we have to acknowledge that leading virtual teams is different, that some of the challenges are different, and that it's going to require some different skills, particularly when you think about how do you build trust collaboratively and collaboration for people you never see or don't see very often. This is particularly true for global virtual teams, but it also has application to domestic ones also. I think the other thing is important to keep in mind is that organizations need both management and leadership skills in order to thrive. And I think we have to honor both of those roles. Some jobs are structured to be more management oriented, and others are focused more on the skills of leadership. But that said, what we find is oftentimes people have a preference and a mindset for one role more than the other. I've seen organizations that have been overmanaged and underled. When was the last time you bought a VHS videotape? Blockbuster at one time was a very successful organization, but I would postulate that perhaps what they didn't acknowledge was the changes in customer needs and the trends. On the other hand, organizations can be overled and undermanaged. And in those instances, organizations and their leaders are focusing on future possibilities and new ideas on the leading edge, and what they didn't provide as much value to was ensuring quality, consistency, and timeliness in service. An organization's culture is highly influences the roles and the skills that are valued and nurtured and rewarded in organizations. And changing an organization's culture starts at the top, and it takes some concentrated effort. So again, I would say start with your team and really think about what are the skills and roles and tasks that we need. And some of those will fall into one camp, some of them will fall into the other camp, but both roles have to be valued.
Thank you. And can you provide a little bit more clarity about what you mean by make the implicit explicit?
In a face-to-face conversation, words only account for about 15% of the meaning that people take away from the conversation. In face-to-face, body language accounts for about 55% and tone of voice accounts for about 38% of the meaning that people take away from a conversation. So in other words, people are more focused on body language and tone of voice to understand the meaning of a message than the words alone, especially if they detect a misalignment between the words that are being used and the tone of voice and body language. Now, in a phone conversation where you only have words and tone of voice, words now account for about a whopping 15% of the meaning. And when you think about emails and text, those are 100% of the message. And do those ever get interpreted? I think we've all had that experience. The point is when communicating virtually, we have to be more clear and specific in our word choice, and we have to make sure that our tone of voice is aligned with the words. And the same applies with a webcam. We can't assume that the other person received the same message we implied. So we have to be much more intentional, and a good practice is to ask the other person to repeat or summarize their understanding of what we've been talking about or what the words were.
All right, thank you, Lee. We have one more question I'm going to pose, and I like this one. I think it's a good way to wrap things up. What's one of the best pieces of advice you've received about leading from a distance?
I would say the best piece of advice is to make the implicit explicit. In the absence of face-to-face interactions, you have to be ultra clear in your language and make sure that your tone of voice and your visible body language are aligned. There's just too many opportunities for misunderstandings. Keeping in mind the degree to which many people are multitasking. So we have to do what we can. We have to put in place some of these best practices to engage people, to let people know that we are concerned and care, to provide both the structure about what gets done and how it gets done, as well as the support about the meaning behind why it gets done, and to do that in a way that people feel both productive and inspired.
Great, thank you. And thank you everybody for those wonderful questions. I know we have a couple more things to do before we wrap up here, Lee. So again, thank you everyone for the questions.
I just want to mention that following the webinar today, that 2 participants will receive a complimentary copy of my book, Literally Virtually. You'll be contacted following the webinar, and for those of you who don't happen to be the winners, it's available on Amazon.com.
Great, Lee. Thank you so much again for your time today, and thank you to everyone who joined us. Later this week, you will be receiving a link to a survey that you can use to provide feedback on today's webinar. And we're also going to provide a link to view a recording of today's webinar as well. For more information about the alumni services provided by the Wisconsin School of Business, or to sign up for future alumni webinars, please visit us online at wsb.wisc.edu/alumni. So Lee, thank you again, and thank you again, everybody, for attending, and we hope you have a wonderful day.